week.
Correct. There won't be any labs to turn in this week.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's never really a good lab that goes along with the endocrine system anyway. And you'll need that since it's the nervous system and the endocrine system it's all pretty big, and that'll be a lot to study for the test. So then it makes more sense to do the blood typing after we do the cardiovascular system, and then we'll be back on track with this, right? We'll have 2 weeks with the cardiovascular system because that's pretty in-depth. And we'll do the blood typing that first week and the heart dissection the second week. We'll kind of be back on track at that point. So what kind of questions do you have for me? What things do you have for me? Anything that you guys want to talk about?
Just trying to get back into the grind.
Right? So I almost think it's harder with a week off sometimes, but
Yeah. I was so focused and good, and now I'm just like, nah.
I had really good intentions of catching up on things and like getting ahead of the game last week, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
The weather turned nice and we all get spring fever, right? And
oh yeah,
it's nicer to be outside with the kids or whatever than it is to be on the computer. Yeah, I did the same sorts of things. My yard is all cleaned up though, so that's nice.
Yep, I worked on mine a little bit.
Oh my goodness, my flowers are popping through. I'm so excited.
Nice.
I can never figure out what happens over the winter. It's like all this trash was not there, and then when the snow melts, it's there.
Yep.
It makes me crazy.
Yep.
It's the dog poop for me.
Yeah, that's true.
I was gonna say that, Becky. It's the dog.
I guess I missed a lot over the.
Or toys. Like the only trash that it could be is like toys that he's destroyed that got covered by snow.
As my dog's looking at me like, really?
Yeah.
Really? The yard is. I can go out there every day and pick it up, and there's so many yards full of poop.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was reading all week last week, and I came up with the function of pancreas and diabetes mellitus. So, I understand the insulin and the blood glucose, but I have question on hypoglycemia, where that fall into. Is that will develop into diabetes mellitus, or?
It could be caused by diabetes mellitus. In other words, you could, if a person has diabetes, then they could end up hypoglycemic. So it's an indication that somebody could have diabetes. Hypoglycemia itself wouldn't lead to diabetes. It's just low blood sugar, right? So it's caused by something. And one of the things it can be caused by is if you have diabetes, you're not storing the blood sugar when you're, when you're eating it, you're not storing it. So then when you haven't eaten anything for a while, there's no stored sugar. So you end up with really low amounts of sugar in your blood. And that's why diabetics have the danger of crashing and passing out kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't think hyperglycemia hypoglycemia can cause diabetes. The other can, hyperglycemia. If you have high blood sugar, if you take in too much sugar, your body can actually basically become desensitized to the insulin that you produce. So if your body's always producing insulin to try to store the blood sugar, then after a while your body can become desensitized to it and it doesn't work anymore. But I don't think low blood sugar can lead to diabetes. It's usually more of an effect of it.
Yeah, so it was just simply you did not have enough sugar intake, and therefore homeostasis is reacting, and you just spike up the sugar, and it all leveled up.
Yep.
All right. That's answer it. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. All right. Other questions? So what we can do is go ahead and start looking at slides for the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is always studied, almost always studied with the nervous system, because it is a form of communication, right? You can communicate across your body with the endocrine system. So the biggest difference is that the nervous system happens really quickly, right? The communication goes in milliseconds. It goes in the thousandths of seconds. The endocrine system can take minutes or hours to work, because you're actually producing, you know, a little chemical messenger that gets into the bloodstream, and it floats through the bloodstream to some other point in your body, and it binds to another cell, and it takes longer to work. But the advantage is that its effects are longer lasting, right? So we'll see that the endocrine system, we'll see how it communicates with different parts of the body. Generally, it is what's helping us maintain homeostasis. So like what Juliet and I were talking about with blood glucose levels, blood calcium levels, obviously levels of sex hormone, whether it's estrogen or testosterone, we'll see levels of adrenaline, we'll see all these different things. So it is intercellular communications, mostly just to maintain homeostasis, and this is accomplished through chemical messages. Now the chemical messages in the endocrine system, they're called hormones, right? So you have a gland in your body that'll make a hormone, and it gets into your bloodstream, and it travels to some other part in your body, and it has an effect. And so in the sense that it's a communication system, like I said, it's related to the nervous system, although the nervous system is much faster. The endocrine system is slower. The advantage to the endocrine system is that the effects are much longer lasting. So how do these hormones, how do they choose where to work, right? If you make a hormone, if your pituitary gland, which is by your brain, makes a hormone and it gets into your bloodstream, it travels all throughout your body, why does it only affect certain cells? Well, it will only affect what are called target cells. It will only affect cells that have the correct receptor for that messenger, right? So that messenger gets everywhere. It goes through your bloodstream, which goes throughout your entire body, but it's only going to have an effect on cells that have the correct shaped receptor, right? That's the target cell. That's the key to a target cell being a target of a hormone. So for example, if we're talking about insulin, right, only cells that have the correct insulin receptor are going to respond to insulin. Okay, here's another comparison of the nervous system and the endocrine system. They both rely on the release of chemicals to bind to specific receptors. They both share chemical messengers. In the endocrine system, they're called hormones, chemical messengers. In the nervous system, they're called neurotransmitters, right? And we talked a little bit about the neurotransmitters, how they get released by the axon terminal, and they cross the synapse, and then they bind to a receptor. Both are regulated by negative feedback. What that means is you produce that chemical messenger until you no longer need it. And we'll talk more about negative feedback in a few minutes. And both are coordinating or regulating activities of other cells, tissues, and organs to maintain homeostasis. Okay. So the endocrine system is all endocrine cells and tissues. It's basically glands and hormones that they release. So you may have heard that some glands are endocrine and some glands are exocrine, right? What are those prefixes, endo and exo? What do those mean?
It's inside, happening inside, and then exocrine is going outside.
Good.
The body.
So we have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands release their product inside the body, so into the bloodstream, right? Their product stays in the body. Exocrine glands release their products to the outside of the body. So think of something like a sweat gland, right? Or a gland that produces tears, your lacrimal gland. Those are producing something that's being released to the outside of the body. So in this chapter, we're talking about only endocrine glands, only things that make hormones. And here is just an overview of the major endocrine glands that we will talk about today and tomorrow. Okay, in the purple, those are the major endocrine glands. And then over kind of on the right side where it's a little more tan colored, these are organs with endocrine function. That's not their main function. In other words, something like the heart, obviously the heart is there to pump blood around the body. The heart does actually release a hormone called ANP, but it's not really considered, even though it has endocrine function, it's a secondary endocrine function, right? That's not the primary purpose of that gland. So groups of hormones. Now this book lists them into 3 groups. I always lump them into 2 groups. And the reason is because on this page, the first 2 groups are very similar, right? One group is amino acid derivatives, the other group are peptide hormones. Well, peptides are just chains of amino acids, right? So amino acid derivatives are smaller. They're like just one link on the chain, whereas peptide hormones are multiple links of a chain, right? Either way, I consider those the same thing. They're made of, it's proteins, they're amino acids. They are things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroid hormone, melatonin, ADH, oxytocin. The third group that they list, which is kind of the second category that I list, are lipid-based hormones. So you've got one group of hormones that's all protein-based, amino acids, proteins, and a second group that's all lipid-based. And those are called steroid hormones. They are similar to cholesterol in structure, and they are things like prostaglandins, they are things like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. And so here, again, you can see that this is showing the target action of hormones, right? So here on the left, this would be an endocrine gland releasing a hormone into the bloodstream. So the hormone is this purple thing, whatever this purple thing is. It gets into your bloodstream. It travels through the bloodstream everywhere in your body. Now, it can get out of your bloodstream over here near neurons, or it can get out of your bloodstream over here near muscle fibers. The reason that it's only having an effect on muscles in this case is because the muscle fiber has the correct receptor. Right? It's still getting to the neurons, but the neurons don't have the correct receptor for that hormone. So it's not that your body's only sending this hormone to one area, it's that the hormone is only going to bind to the cells that have the correct receptor. So the target of this hormone would be the skeletal muscle fiber. I'm going to go back to these groups of hormones for a minute. So I said that there are amino acid or protein-based hormones, and then there are steroid hormones or lipid hormones. Their method of action is very different, okay? Hold on, let me just skip ahead real quick and see if I have a good picture of that. I don't. All right, so what I will do is post something about this, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow. But think about what a hormone does, right? I told you now it targets a cell. The cell has to have the correct receptor. A cell is surrounded by what? What's the thing that surrounds the cell called?
Extracellular fluid.
Extracellular. So what separates the extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid?
The membrane.
The membrane, the plasma membrane. Good. What's the plasma membrane made of?
Phospholipid.
Yeah, bilipids.
Phospholipid, yeah, bilipid layer. So the thing that surrounds the cell is made up of lipids. Proteins are water soluble. Lipids are lipid soluble. What that means is if you have a lipid, it'll never dissolve in water, right? You can mix up oil and water all day long. As soon as you set that bottle down, they're going to separate. So if I have some hormones that are made of lipids and some that are made of proteins, are they going to be able to cross that plasma membrane equally? Are they both going to be able to cross that plasma membrane?
No.
No,
Which hormones can get across that plasma membrane?
the lipids.
The lipids. Good. So this category, this third category that they're saying, the lipid derivatives, the steroid hormones, those can get across that lipid membrane. So the receptors for these, for the lipid hormones, are inside the cells. Okay, because this hormone actually diffuses across the plasma membrane, it diffuses across the nuclear membrane, it gets into the nucleus, it binds to a receptor, does a bunch of things. The amino acid derivatives and the protein hormones, can they get across that lipid bilayer?
No. So
No,
No.
they
They
have.
require help, like wouldn't they require more energy to do that?
They would,
Right.
but what they have instead is the receptors that are for these hormones are on the surface of the cell.
Oh.
So if you're talking about an amino acid or a peptide hormone, that's a non-steroid hormone, right? It's protein derived. And it's going to bind to a receptor on the surface of the target cell. Whereas the lipid hormones are going to actually diffuse into the target cell and bind to a receptor inside the target cell. As a result, non-steroid hormones, hormones that are made of proteins, are much faster acting, and hormones that are made of lipids are much slower acting. Because it takes longer for that lipid hormone to diffuse across the plasma membrane, across the nuclear membrane, it binds to a receptor in the nucleus, it just takes longer. So steroid hormones, something like testosterone is always the example I use of a steroid hormone. You don't need that to happen quickly, right? All a body needs is for a continuous supply of testosterone to keep homeostasis going. If we go back to something like insulin that we talked about at the beginning, does insulin have to work quickly?
yeah.
Yeah, right? Right after you eat, your blood sugar is going to get really high. You need that insulin to store the blood sugar. Well, guess what? Insulin is actually an amino acid derived or a peptide derived hormone. So you have to know the differences. Again, they say 3 groups of hormones. I group these first 2 into the same group. They are water soluble. They are binding to receptors on the surface of the cell. They are fast acting.
I might be going way off here, but it just reminds me of when we were explained at work about messenger RNA and the COVID vaccine, and how it's different than normal, like a flu vaccine, because I don't know even the wording, but like, is it enzymes normally? It's something with the enzymes, and that this one was in a different, is it a lipid based like shell, and that's why it. Does any of this sound familiar, or like, am I?
No, I actually don't know enough about the
right.
vaccine to tell you.
It was very complicated, but I know that it was something to do with the difference between, flu vaccines, and then we were asking what the difference was between messenger RNA vaccines versus.
It's the other one is a vector, which consists of inactive virus.
Right.
Yeah, it was something to do with the shell that it's in. They said shell. I do know that, but anyway, I'll have to ask my boss if she remembers any more.
Yeah,
because
definitely, because I'd like to know.
That for me, and I was curious.
I'm getting the first dose tomorrow, so I'd like to know.
Oh, great. Yep. All right. I'm gonna have to find out about that now.
Yeah, there must be a difference in the way that they're manufactured, but I don't know enough about them to.
I just remember it was something about the lipids and the bilayer and stuff, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm putting all this together now, but on either end of it now, I'm not really sure of the whole, enough details to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but something about it's familiar, so I will have to find out.
Yeah, definitely. Let us know.
Sure.
Okay. So we've got the endocrine system. It only works on target cells that have the correct receptor. We've got the two different types of hormones, steroid and non-steroid. Steroid hormones are slow acting. They can get across the membrane. Non-steroid hormones are fast acting. They bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. Then, for the most part, we are going to start going through the chapter and actually talking about the different glands and what they release and what they do, what those hormones do. This whole thing is controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is actually part of your brain. It's below the thalamus, therefore hypothalamus. It hangs down from your brain. This is what mainly controls the endocrine system. And hanging down from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. Okay, and the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary controls much of the other hormones, the other glands. So the hypothalamus does secrete a few hormones itself, but a lot of what it does is actually controls the pituitary, which secretes hormones. Okay, so there are these 3 points which we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So here is a close-up of the hypothalamus hanging down from the brain. So it's this part of the brain that's enlarged. Here's your hypothalamus, and hanging down from that is your pituitary gland. The stalk that it hangs from is called the infundibulum. Okay, and the pituitary is divided into a posterior lobe and an anterior lobe. Right? Anterior is towards the front, posterior towards the back. And they are divided because they work a little bit different. They do things a little differently. So the hypothalamus itself produces two hormones that are secreted by the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So the hypothalamus is making ADH and OXT. Okay. We'll talk more about what they do in a few minutes. The hypothalamus makes those two hormones. They get secreted by the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So this is the green pathway here. Okay, they get released into the bloodstream by the posterior lobe of the pituitary. The hypothalamus also makes other hormones which have an effect on the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Now, from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, it's only a few millimeters, right? But there's actually a capillary system here. And so the hypothalamus makes some hormones that get into the bloodstream, and their target is only a few millimeters away. It is at the anterior lobe of the pituitary, right? So there's the hypothalamus will make a hormone which gets into your bloodstream, travels just to here, right? Or, I mean, travels everywhere, but once it travels just to that anterior lobe, it can have an effect on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, causing the anterior lobe of the pituitary to release other hormones into your body. Okay, so that's a stepwise process. It's different than what's happening in the posterior lobe, right? These are the actual same hormones are being released by the posterior lobe. This is, you've got hormone A, which stimulates hormone B, which in turn we'll see stimulates a C hormone. And then there's this third pathway that's a little bit weird, but it's only in one particular instance. There is control from your nervous system to your adrenal medulla. Okay, so this is your adrenal gland. Where is your adrenal gland?
On top of the kidneys?
On top of the kidney, good. Renal always means kidney, so add renal on top of the kidney. The adrenal gland is divided into a medulla and a cortex because they do different things. The medulla is just the middle of it. The cortex is the outer thickness. The medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's what we call adrenaline. When you get a rush of adrenaline, right, your heart starts pounding and your breathing changes. That is epinephrine and norepinephrine. That connection is just a pathway from your brain directly to your adrenal medulla. has nothing to do with any of these hormones being released by the pituitary, right? Your brain senses a threat. It can be real or just perceived, right? It's not necessarily a real threat, but that's what kicks in that rush of adrenaline, that fight or flight syndrome, right? Is those nerves going directly to the medulla of your adrenal gland. Okay, so this third pathway is only that one instance, right? It's only when you're talking about the adrenal medulla, and it's only because it's releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. This first pathway is only for two hormones, ADH and oxytocin. The second pathway is the one that's much larger and more complex.
I have a question
Sure.
about the first pathway. By looking at the picture, are they, the way it works, are they working like axons and neurons, while the pathway 2 are just your chemical on the bloodstream?
Nope.
No.
That's a good question. So ADH and oxytocin are both chemical messengers. They're both hormones. So they're being made and secreted into the bloodstream. So they're being made by the hypothalamus, but they don't actually get into the bloodstream until they get to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So
Okay.
they're not.
It's just
They're not
the way it draws, the way
Yeah,
it looks like neurons with dendrites.
Right. Yeah, they're not actually neurons.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. It's protected by the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. If you remember a long time ago when we studied the bone structure, the sphenoid bone is one of the bones of the cranium. It holds your skull from underneath. So it's behind your nose and your eyes. It's holding your skull. And that has a little raised area called the sella turcica. And so you can think, if you're picturing your brain here, your eyes and your nose are up here, right? Behind it, there's a bone holding the bottom of your brain called the sphenoid. And there's a little structure in the sphenoid bone, almost like a little chair that it can sit in, called the sella turcica. Okay, and that's where this pituitary sits. And it hangs down from the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. The anterior and the posterior portions of this gland are different. All told, the pituitary gland secretes 9 hormones. Okay, all of them are unique peptides or small proteins. So all of them are in those first 2 classes of hormones, right? They're non-steroidal hormones. They work very quickly. And all of them are binding to receptors on the surface of cells, and they're using what's called the second messenger system. So they bind to the surface receptor, and then something changes inside the cell. It's like a domino effect. Okay. So again, here is a brain. Here's an enlargement of the brain. Here's your hypothalamus and your pituitary hanging down. Just to give you an idea of geography, the optic chiasm, that's where your optic nerves enter your brain. They kind of crossed over underneath your brain. That's kind of right in front of, just anterior to this. Right? And if you look at this, if you look at the histology of the pituitary, if you look at it under a microscope, you can see that the histology of the anterior lobe looks very different than that of the posterior lobe. And it's because they actually secrete different things, right? The posterior lobe is actually secreting different hormones. The anterior lobe. The posterior lobe is releasing 2 hormones, ADH and oxytocin, that are created by the hypothalamus. So you can almost see in this picture that the posterior lobe is just a continuation of the brain, whereas the anterior lobe is something different altogether. Yeah. So here is the system of capillaries, the system of blood vessels. That is a network between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. is called the hypophyseal portal system. Right? And so all that's doing is that your hypothalamus is creating certain hormones and secreting them into this hypophyseal portal system. So the superior hypophyseal artery delivers blood to a capillary network in the upper infundibulum. The vessels deliver blood containing regulatory factors to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and then the inferior hypophyseal artery delivers blood to the posterior lobe. All this is saying is that there are some hormones that are being made here in the hypothalamus. They get into this capillary system, and they have an effect. Their target cells are here in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland.
So are regulatory factors hormones?
Yes.
That's all it means. Okay, all right.
Yep, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know why they changed language. The posterior lobe of the pituitary is different. The hypothalamus, these cells up here in the hypothalamus are actually producing ADH and oxytocin, which then gets into your bloodstream all the way down here in the posterior lobe of the pituitary to get into your bloodstream. Okay, so the difference is the hypothalamus makes these two hormones, which are secreted by the, secreted by the posterior lobe of your pituitary. The hypothalamus makes other hormones which actually have and target hormones or target cells in the anterior pituitary, which causes the anterior pituitary to make more hormones.
So the wording of secreting and releasing, is that just differentiating if it's released or if it's put into the bloodstream or not? Is that?
So secreting means, so these cells in the anterior are secreting because they are producing the hormone and putting it into the bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the cells in the posterior portion of the pituitary are just releasing that hormone into the bloodstream.
Okay.
They're not considered secreting it because they don't make it. It's made up here and then secreted down there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So the anterior lobe, right? This is the one that's producing a bunch of hormones, 7 hormones, contains endocrine cells, right? This has the capillaries that are the hypophyseal portal system. They are capillaries that link the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, this hypophyseal artery delivers blood to the first capillary bed, and then regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus travel through portal veins to the second capillary bed of the anterior lobe of the pituitary. All that's saying is that the hypothalamus produces hormones that get into this portal system. They travel through the bloodstream just a couple of millimeters to the anterior pituitary, and that's where their target cells are. And so once they reach those target cells, they stimulate those target cells to make another hormone, which then gets secreted by the anterior pituitary. Right? These hormones are going to bind to target cells in the anterior lobe. The hormones, they may be inhibitory, releasing, or a combination of the two. So just to make it more complex, right? They could be inhibiting hormones or causing more of a secretion, but we're not going to worry about that. And most of these hormones are tropic hormones. So the definition of tropic hormone means that it targets other endocrine glands. Many of the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary, right, they are kind of the second hormones in the chain, right? You've got the hypothalamus producing hormones, targeting cells in the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary makes hormones. A lot of times that second hormone is still a tropic hormone, meaning that it still targets another endocrine gland. We'll see that there is a hormone that targets the thyroid. There is one that targets the adrenal cortex. There are 2 that target either ovaries or testes, right? So they're tropic hormones because they're targeting another gland downstream. And these are the 7 hormones that are produced by the anterior lobe. So oftentimes the name tells you something about what it does, right? And we're going to go through in the next few slides and talk about each of these hormones. So the first one to think about, so in other words, I don't want you to memorize the names of the hormones that the hypothalamus secretes to the anterior pituitary, right? Almost nobody will ask you those ever. I don't know why. Books don't really go into it very much because it's only traveling a few millimeters. But what's more important is to know the names of the hormones that are released, that are secreted and released by the anterior pituitary, because those are the ones that are having big effects in your body. Okay. The first one to talk about is thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, what do you think thyroid stimulating hormone, what do you think it does? What does it stimulate?
Your thyroid.
Thyroid.
The thyroid. Okay. So
That
TSH
seemed
stimulates
too
your
easy.
thyroid. What is
Our
your thyroid?
thyroid,
What does your thyroid do?
metabolism.
Metabolism, right? So this, in a lot of ways, is affecting your metabolism. If what this hormone does, TSH, it goes to your thyroid and it causes your thyroid to release other hormones. Okay. We will talk about those later on in the chapter. So right now, all you have to think about, all you have to know is that the anterior pituitary is releasing TSH, okay? And that's targeting your thyroid gland. It's going to stimulate the release of thyroid hormones, okay? And that in turn increases your metabolism. And we'll talk about what those thyroid hormones are later. Another hormone released, so that's a tropic hormone, right? It's affecting your thyroid gland. Another hormone that's released by the anterior pituitary is also tropic, is called the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, it's a big word, it's a mouthful to say. It's usually just called ACTH. But from the word adreno, so what gland is it affecting?
Adrenal.
The adrenal gland. Cortico, because it's affecting the adrenal cortex, not the adrenal medulla. And tropic, it's a tropic hormone, so it's affecting the adrenal cortex. Okay, so it's targeting the adrenal cortex. This stimulates the adrenal cortex to release hormones. And we'll talk about what those do when we get to the adrenal cortex. Right, so for right now, you're just saying, okay, the anterior pituitary releases ACTH, which goes to the adrenal cortex, which does something else, which we're not worried about right now. We'll get to it in a minute. The anterior pituitary releases gonadotropins. Those regulate activities of the gonads, which are the ovaries or the testes. They are released in response to GnRH from the hypothalamus. So again, this is GnRH is the hormone that the hypothalamus makes that only travels a few millimeters, right? And it causes the anterior pituitary to release these 2 hormones, FSH and LH. Collectively, they are called gonadotropins. There are 2 of them. They're always talked about together. Okay. Together, FSH and LH stimulates either the ovaries or the testes. They were first documented, I think, in females. That's why they have the names follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, because those are both related to parts of the reproductive cycle in the female. But they are also present in men, and they stimulate the testes. So what we'll see is, again, these are tropic hormones. They are stimulating the ovaries to release their hormones or the testes to release their hormones. Okay, so far we've talked about 4 different hormones: TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH. They're all tropic hormones. Then, this goes into follicle stimulating hormone and LH. Okay. Then there are some other hormones that are released and produced and released by the anterior pituitary. Prolactin. Now, from the word prolactin, what do you think? What do you think that's doing?
Has to do with lactation.
Yep, has to do with lactation. Pro, so you think it's going to upregulate lactation, right? That makes sense. This is a target. This is targeting the mammary glands in females. It stimulates mammary gland development, and so when a woman is pregnant and nursing, it stimulates production of milk. Okay, so the more a child nurses, the more prolactin a woman produces and the more milk that her body will produce. So this is not tropic because it's not affecting another endocrine gland. Yeah, Melissa.
Just curious. So you said that it stimulates mammary gland development. So if your glands, for some reason, have trauma to them or are, like for the sake of a breast reduction, where they remove your nipple completely and have to cut all that duct work, would taking prolactin like reattach those ducts and make it so that you can breastfeed later on? Is there like a way to take that? And
that I don't know. So my thought with, as far as I understand reductions go, so most breast tissue is adipose, it's fat tissue. And so my thought with the reduction is they take adipose tissue. So you actually, the breasts don't produce, you don't have mammary glands until you're pregnant. Like a woman won't have mammary glands until she's pregnant. And so, so I think even if a woman has a reduction, I think there would not necessarily be any issues with breastfeeding. Well, I know with some women there's not. I know a woman who had a reduction and had a child and breastfed.
See, I did too, and I couldn't feed, like it just didn't work. So I didn't know if, now reading this chapter, if it was possible to like rework those for future children. But okay.
So I mean, it could be possible that I don't know a ton about reductions, but I think they're usually just taking out adipose tissue. They're usually just taking out the fat because that's primarily what's causing the breast to be large.
Right.
That's primarily what the breast is made of.
Okay.
But I
wonder if it has to do with like the surgeon too, because my friend went through this and she has not been able to breastfeed, and she was told that it's because she has like half the amount of the ducts now, or the glands.
Oh.
So I wonder if it has to do with like maybe how much of a reduction, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I was 16 when it happened, and they told me that there's a potential that it could, but at 16, who's thinking about breastfeeding, right?
Right.
I was just like, take them, I don't want them.
Yeah, go with it, yeah.
But it was more or less because they had to remove the nipple completely to, do whatever they had to do and then shrink it and then reattach it. So I guess once I got pregnant with my son, I just assumed that the ductwork never reconnected.
I mean, it could be that. I'm not saying it couldn't be that. I don't know enough about what the procedure is of doing the reduction. But I know people that have had reductions that have successfully breastfed. So it is possible.
Okay,
I have a question.
Yeah.
I watched this documentary of a gay couple. The male side gave birth. Okay, and then the other female get the injection, and she was the one nursing instead of the biological mother. So is that some kind of hormones that stimulate lactation?
Yes.
Similar to prolactin?
Yeah, so oxytocin is one of them that can actually stimulate the milk letdown reflex. It'll stimulate so oxytocin is a hormone that's secreted when a woman is giving birth, actively giving birth. And so there are hormones that mimic that. So that it would essentially cause the body to feel like it gave birth, and therefore it's producing milk.
Oh, that's why she was able to nourish the baby.
Even in some cases where women have had trouble breastfeeding, there are hormones that can help. That there's all different reasons why breastfeeding doesn't work. My son never latched on. My daughter breastfed for a year. I don't know why. doesn't, I mean, there's just all
Interesting.
kinds of things that can happen, I guess.
It's just interesting in what, alteration of this hormone can do.
Yeah.
This
There's-
is just for milk production, because I know like when you breastfeed, your uterus contracts. That's the
Mhm.
oxytocin that you're,
That's the oxytocin.
right? Okay, okay, all right.
Yeah.
So there is some relation there, but not this one.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So the oxytocin is actually, we'll get to it in a few minutes, but
Yeah.
it's the one that causes uterine contractions.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there is truth there, not truth. There is the fact that if you breastfeed, the uterus shrinks quicker.
Yeah.
Right? 'Cause there's
Yeah.
hormones involved in that. Yeah.
And it, like more so every child that I had, it seemed like by the time I had my third child, it was like so painful to nurse, but not my
Really?
breast, my uterus. Yeah,
Wow.
it's interesting. And we'll get to it also when you talk about it, but I would never dilated on my own at all
Mm-hmm.
with any of my labors.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll probably talk about that as well. I had to be
Yep.
induced.
That was
so.
my wife. My wife, they had a Foley ball and they had everything else. They gave her all kinds of Pertussin.
Oh
and,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's so
nope,
frustrating.
C-section.
No, I didn't
not
end
gonna
up
happen that
having
way.
a C-section, but it took a long
Yep.
time. But,
Yep.
all right.
Oh, she had to do a C-section. She went 22 hours and nothing.
I don't know why they
Dilated.
didn't, honestly. I really don't know. My son was like 3 days.
Yeah.
But,
She only dilated a couple of centimeters. And
Yep,
they were like, nope,
yep,
we
me too.
gotta cut her open. Take this
Oh,
out.
the joy of motherhood.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the C-section is really hard to recover from.
Oh, yeah,
too.
yeah.
It's surgery. I mean, she's got a cut from, one side of her belly to the other, basically. It's big.
Yeah. Wow.
So prolactin is released by the anterior pituitary. It is not tropic. It is affecting another gland, but the mammary glands are not endocrine glands, right? They're exocrine glands. They're secreting their product to the outside of the body. Okay, growth hormone. Growth hormone's an interesting one. Growth hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary. What do you think growth hormone stimulates?
Growth.
Growth, okay? It stimulates growth mostly of bone and muscle, okay? It is something that is, there's a little bit about that, okay. It is something that is released and produced in high levels and high amounts when you're a child, because think about the amount of growth that you go through from being an infant to being an adult. So the first 18 years of your life, you're producing a lot of growth hormone. As we age after that, we produce less and less of it. Okay, because you're not growing anymore. Now, where have you guys heard of growth hormone, like in the news? Probably
Sports,
sports,
In the
right?
dairy
A lot of,
athletes.
yeah, a lot of athletes are abusing this. So testosterone is a hormone that builds muscle, and a lot of athletes abuse that to, they use large amounts of it to build more muscle than their competitors. And there's a lot of tests for that because that's been around for a long time. Growth hormone is something that has been manufactured in a lab for less time. And so there are fewer tests for it. And the tests tend to be blood tests. They don't have any very reliable urine tests at this point. And so testing for it's really hard just because it's costly and everything else. So a lot of athletes are abusing growth hormone. And get prescriptions for growth hormone and use that because it stimulates muscle growth and bone growth. So there can be some side effects. In particular, if you continue to produce growth hormone, it can cause some of your bones to grow. And most noticeably, it would be the bones like of the forehead, of the jaw, and of your hands. So the normal situation, right, is you produce high amounts of growth hormone when you're young, slow way down in production as you get old, as you get to be an adult. There is a situation where your body continues to produce growth hormone through your whole life, right? And you will continue to grow through your whole life. So this is, if you guys know who Andre the Giant was, he had this condition. It's called acromegaly. And you continue to grow throughout your whole life. And usually the reason that you die from that is just that your body can't support, your organs get so large, your body just can't support this anymore. And if you look at Andre the Giant, if you look at pictures of him, his head was really wide, right? His jaw was really wide, all that sort of thing. There is evidence that athletes that abuse growth hormone for a long period of time can have that sort of thing happen to them. And you're talking about really high doses for, consistent amount of time. But, just look at, if you guys know who Barry Bonds is, look at pictures of Barry Bonds in the early 90s versus the early 2000s. His face looks different. And he was never actually found guilty of using anything, but his entire face, his head looks different. So there is studies that suggest that your bones will continue to grow. The other thing about growth hormone is it's mostly going to cause bones and muscles to grow, but it can also cause internal organs to grow. So I always think about wrestlers, right? WWE wrestlers. They're out there and they look huge and they're all jacked. And they look like they have abs, right, from the front. And then when they turn sideways, they look bloated. That's commonly called GH gut. And what is happening is they are abusing this at such high levels that their internal organs are growing. Their internal organs are getting bigger and their gut is swelling to accommodate that. So that just gives you an idea of, when you see that, how bad that can be for your health, right? We look at that as like, oh, that guy's in really good shape, but that's probably doing a lot more damage to that person's body than anything that we're doing.
Wouldn't those organs rupture at some point?
It could.
That's crazy.
Right. That's, I guess that's, I don't know. I've never been in a situation where I could potentially make millions of dollars, so I can't say what my decision would be, but, I think that's a decision that some people are willing to take. They're like, well, if I'm going to be famous and make, $10 million doing this, I'll take the risk. Okay. So growth hormone has, a direct effect on bones, on muscles, on different organs like your liver. Right. So here are the actions of it, right? It stimulates epithelial and connective tissues to differentiate and grow, right? That's going to cause you to look bigger. It's going to cause muscles to look bigger. It causes breakdown of stored fats and release of fatty acids. So that's also going to cause you to look bigger, right? To reduce your fat. But it causes breakdown of glycogen reserves and reserves of glucose in the bloodstream. So it does affect your liver. Again, all these things are reasons why growth hormone can actually be a good thing in small doses, and it's prescribed in low doses to people, especially to men now. It seems there's more and more men getting prescriptions for growth hormone as they get older, because they're starting to lose the effects of testosterone, of growth hormone.
I have a question about growth hormones. So if the child is smaller than average, can they induce or give something?
Yep.
I wish my parents gave some.
Yep, they actually do that too. If a child is like very low on the growth curve, they will give them doses of growth hormone in order to try to catch them up to their peers. Again, all very controlled and monitored and all that sort of thing. But yes, they do give that to children sometimes.
That's good to know. Thank you.
You're welcome. Your anterior pituitary also makes melanocyte stimulating hormone. What do you think melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulates?
Melanin, color of skin.
Yep. So it appears to be non-functional in adults, and some books mention MSH and some books don't, because nobody really understands very well what it does. Okay. It is found in higher levels in pregnant women, in young children, and even in certain diseases, but there's no correlation as to why. People can't understand why. It's not like MSH is higher in people with darker skin. It's not, you know what I mean? It's not like a direct correlation like that. So sometimes books don't even really mention this hormone because there's not really any known function of it at this point.
So I have a,
Mhm.
I read this article, and they said that when a woman, which, you know, I went through it myself, when the woman is pregnant, it's
Mhm.
like they started having those lines between the chest going down to the navel. It's called linea nigra.
Mhm.
Is it something to do with that melanocyte?
I don't know. It could be. It could be that the melanocytes from the pregnant woman are producing melanin that's going to the child,
Right,
for the child's skin. It could be
because it
that. I
went
don't know. I
away.
don't know enough about that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I
it could be.
have that, and then it went away after giving birth.
Right. Huh. Yeah, it could be. Makes sense.
Right. It makes sense that you mentioned. It's like, oh, that explains why I get
Right.
those and then disappear.
Mm-hmm. It does make sense. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So these are the two hormones that are actually produced by the hypothalamus and then just released by the posterior pituitary. Those are ADH and oxytocin. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. What's a diuretic?
It is a liquid in the body that has to do with osmosis.
Okay.
It removes
So if you
water.
take a diuretic, what's it do?
What
Removes water.
Makes you
retain
lose
water?
water, right? Makes you pee, makes you lose water. So an antidiuretic helps you retain water. So we have this hormone called ADH that causes us to retain water when, well, we'll get to that. So when the body is low on water, your posterior pituitary releases ADH. When you get dehydrated, your body says, okay, don't let go of that water, hold on to it, right? We're not getting very much water, we're dehydrated. Its primary target is the kidney, because that's where you lose water. Think about it. If you are drinking a lot of water when you pee, what color is your pee?
Clear.
Clear,
Clear.
right? If you're drinking a lot of water, your body just keeps sending that water through your kidneys to your bladder to get rid of it because you don't need it. If you haven't drank, right? If you're outside on a hot day and you haven't drank enough, your pee is usually like a dark yellow, right? And it's because there's not very much water going to your bladder. Your body's holding on to it. Your kidneys are saying, no, I'm not going to let go of that water. We need to hold on to it. That's primarily because of this hormone. It's produced in response to the hypothalamic osmoreceptor stimulation. So when you're dehydrated, you're going to produce ADH. Now, there are certain things, certain foods that we consume, alcohol that we consume. Alcohol is a huge inhibitor of ADH. And coffee is an inhibitor of ADH. So if you drink a lot of coffee, you're inhibiting ADH. You're inhibiting your body from holding on to water, right? Coffee is a diuretic. It's going to make you pee. Alcohol does this. If you think about this, if you go out drinking, right, you have to pee a lot. When you drink, like if you're drinking beer or whatever, you end up having to pee a lot. And what's happening is you are not holding on to any water. You're peeing it all out. And so you get really dehydrated. And what causes you to feel hungover the next day is that you're so dehydrated, right? That's the reason you feel hungover. That's the reason why you feel sluggish and you have a headache and everything else. You feel all dry. It's because you're dehydrated. So certain things are definitely inhibitors of ADH. That's the hormone that's responsible for holding onto water. And then oxytocin is also produced by the posterior pituitary. In women, it stimulates contraction of uterine muscles during labor and delivery. It also stimulates contraction of cells surrounding milk, secretory cells, and mammary glands. So not only does it cause uterine contractions, which helps you give birth, but it also starts what's called the milk letdown reflex. So it's kind of a signal to the body that, okay, this person's giving birth, then she has to produce milk now to nourish her young child, because that's what mammals do. It plays an unclear role in sexual activity. There are studies trying to figure out what's going on with it. Remember, hormones are produced by men and women. Oxytocin is produced in men and women, but men don't have a uterus or mammary glands. So what is it doing there? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the targets are in a male, right? Or if there even are targets in a male. So this map, even though it looks confusing at first, is actually really good. It shows these pituitary hormones and their targets, okay? So up here at the top is your hypothalamus, and here's your pituitary. You can see that the pituitary releases ACTH to go to the adrenal glands, TSH to go to the thyroid, GH, which goes to the liver, right, and actually targets bone and muscle, prolactin, which goes to the mammary glands, FSH and LH, which target either the testes or the ovaries. I hate when I do that. And then you've got MSH. MSH is kind of this weird outlier. It's produced in this tiny little zone between the anterior and posterior pituitary. And nobody really knows the significance of what it does. It targets melanocytes, we know that, but we don't know much else. Then the posterior pituitary produces ADH, which targets the kidneys, and oxytocin, which targets either the uterus, and again, targets the vas deferens in the prostate in males, but we don't really know what it does there. What we are going to continue to talk about in these hormones over on the left side, right? These are considered tropic hormones because they are targeting a gland, which is then secreting another hormone, right? So what we didn't talk about yet is once ACTH reaches the adrenal cortex, what happens? Once TSH reaches the thyroid, what happens? Once FSH and LH reach the testes or the ovaries, what happens? Right, and that's those downstream effects are what we're going to look at next. Over here, don't forget that you do have direct control of the adrenal medulla. So these are neurons, like direct wiring from your brain to your adrenal medulla, so that if you perceive any type of threat, you can activate, you can release adrenaline. Okay, so this diagram looks complicated, but it's actually really, really good and really helpful, I think. And then here they are in words, right? What the hormones do, what they target, and what the effects are. Right. So then we're going to go on to the actual glands that are targeted. So the thyroid is the first one to talk about. Where is your thyroid gland?
Your neck.
Yeah, it's in your neck, in the front of your neck, kind of where your voice box is, where your Adam's apple is. It has two lobes connected by a narrow isthmus, right? So it's just two lobes connected by this little narrow piece. It contains a lot of these follicles, which are filled with a viscous solution called colloid. You don't need to know that very much, but here's what it would look like under a microscope. So you would have each one of these is a follicle, right? And inside the follicle is the colloid, and the cells are these cells around the outside of the follicle. Here's where it's located. This is your Adam's apple, your voice box. This is your thyroid gland just below it. Oh, doesn't go into it. So what does the thyroid do?
Metabolism.
Yeah, it affects your metabolism. So
you said development. So how exactly it works with or metabolism development?
It's your metabolism. So if I go back to this, TSH stimulates the thyroid to produce two hormones called T3 and T4. Those are regulating metabolism. So sometimes that is involved in development, right? How well you can take the nutrients that you're obtaining and break them down and use them for energy, which is your metabolism. That's going to determine your development a lot of times too. If you're underproducing those thyroid hormones, it's going to be harder for you to develop, physically, to develop your bones and your muscles and that sort of thing. So TSH stimulates the thyroid to produce T3 and T4, right? Which, again, if you hear somebody has an overactive thyroid, what it means is that they are producing a lot of T3 or T4, right? And they have a very high metabolism. They're usually people that are high energy that have trouble gaining any weight. Some people have a slow metabolism where they don't produce much of these two hormones. And so they have trouble keeping weight off. Okay, so then we also have the parathyroid gland. Parathyroid glands are kind of behind the thyroid glands. They're posterior to the thyroid gland. Okay, and so they're showing from the back here, but this is really, they're really looking at the back of this person's windpipe, right? On the front of the person's windpipe, on the anterior side is where the thyroid is, and this butterfly-shaped thing is the thyroid. And then these 4 little purple circles are parathyroid glands. We have 4 of them. They produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone, PTH. And that hormone, all it does is it increases blood calcium levels. Okay. Now, so what's calcium important for? It's important for several systems of the body that we talked about. Who can name what systems calcium is important for?
Muscle contractions.
Skeletal and
Muscle
Bones
contraction,
and muscle
bones.
contractions.
Yep. And nervous system, right? It's actually one of the hormones that causes the release of, or one of the, minerals that causes the release of neurotransmitters. So you need calcium for your nervous system to work, for your muscles to work. Anything that we eat or drink gets into our bloodstream. Okay, there's a lot of blood vessels associated with our intestines. So whatever you're eating or drinking gets into your bloodstream. If you're eating foods that are high in calcium, if you're taking calcium supplements, it will get into your bloodstream. And that's good. You want a certain amount of calcium in order for your muscles and your nerves to function normally. So it's really important to regulate how much calcium is in your bloodstream. So if you're not eating enough foods with calcium and you're not taking a supplement for calcium, and you need that calcium because you need it for muscles and for nerves, what will happen is your parathyroid glands will release parathyroid hormone, which goes and it gets calcium. Now, where do you have calcium stored?
Your bones.
In your bones. What parathyroid hormone does is it activates the osteoclasts in your bone. Osteoclasts are those cells that break down the bone, that chew up the bone. And so your parathyroid hormones can detect if you don't have enough calcium in your blood, and they say, oh, okay, well, I know where we can get some calcium, right? And they secrete PTH, which stimulates those osteoclasts to start chewing up some of your bone to get calcium from your bone. Now, what does that do to your bones?
It breaks them down.
Yeah, it makes them more brittle, right? And you end up with brittle bones. The more this happens, the more you end up with brittle bones. So that's why it's important to have calcium in your diet, especially as you're younger, because when you're younger, you are going to take more of that calcium and store the extra calcium in your bones. When you have extra calcium in your blood, you do just the opposite. Your body stores it into the bones. When you don't have enough calcium, your body pulls it from your bones. Okay, this will also stimulate you to secrete calcitriol, which increases how much calcium you absorb from foods you eat. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Sorry for, I'm kind of lost.
Yeah.
It's like I keep listening. It's like, so I don't know if I did a different research. It says the calcitonin is the one that is reduce or release calcium ion.
Right. So you're right. So calcitonin reduces the amount of calcium in your blood.
Reduce. Okay.
Parathyroid hormone increases the amount of calcium in your blood. So just like you regulate glucose in your blood, right? Calcium is really important to regulate. So if the calcium levels get too low, you secrete parathyroid hormone, which goes and grabs calcium from your bone. Yep. So it's going and getting that calcium from your bones so that you have more calcium in your blood, right? It's pulling it from your bones to bring it into your blood. So it's increasing the calcium in your blood, right? So it's stimulated by a decrease in blood calcium. And there's not enough there.
Okay, I got it.
Calcitonin does just the opposite. Calcitonin is a hormone. So that was going to be the next thing I was going to talk about. Calcitonin is a hormone secreted by your thyroid. Calcitonin does just the opposite. When you are eating foods that are high in calcium, and you're taking calcium supplements, and you have more than enough calcium in your blood, calcitonin takes that extra calcium and it stores it in your bones, right? So that you can use it later when you need it. So those two hormones, calcitonin and PTH, are working opposite each other to control blood calcium levels. Now, calcitonin is produced by the thyroid, okay? And it has nothing to do with TSH. Okay, TSH causes the thyroid to produce T3 and T4, which is metabolism. But the thyroid producing calcitonin is only based on how much calcium is in your blood. It has nothing to do with this hormone.
It's clearer now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a thought question related to that, if possible. It's my understanding that, like, in order for the body to know to store the calcium in the muscle or in the bone, that we need vitamin K to make sure it stores in the bone. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Otherwise, it can, like, store too much in the muscle, which can be bad for, like, the heart and I
Right.
think.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
So my question is around, do you know anything about the connection between taking different types of calcium and heart palpitations? Because a friend of mine was saying that, who's like in the medical field, was saying only take certain types of calcium, because I'm just trying to figure out the relationship between, like, knowing how important calcium is with muscle contraction and why it could, like, have you heard of that connection?
Yes, I don't know what the types are, but I know certain calcium in certain forms can be readily stored in your bones, and that's what you want, right? But if you take different forms of calcium, they can be stored in other places in your body, which can do more damage than good. Like, in other words, you're taking a calcium supplement and it's not increasing your bone density or causing your bones to become less brittle, depending on what type of calcium you're taking. But I don't know exactly which types of calcium are, better or worse. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, offhand, I can't remember which ones they were, but for anyone who wants to take a supplement, just check it out, because that's an important thing, I think.
Yep, and it's important with any supplement because they're not really regulated by the FDA or USDA or anybody. It's hard to say what's in them, right, or how effective they are in certain aspects. And also keep in mind that a lot of these supplements, they can, make sure you talk to your doctor, because they can react with different medications you're taking, even though they're just over the counter and you can buy them at Target or whatever. And also you can overtake certain supplements. You can take too much of certain supplements and that can do damage. Calcium being one of them. So, you always want to just keep all that in mind when you're taking any of these supplements.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a resident who is prescribed calcitriol, and she does have some extended growth from a birth defect. So I'm wondering if she just can't, for some reason, create that on her own or something. But she also takes levothyroxine for her thyroid. So it's interesting to me. There's obviously some connection. So
right. So she's probably not producing enough calcitonin because she's taking something for her thyroid.
Yeah.
And they're prescribing her calcitriol because it helps you absorb more calcium from your diet. So those are all ways of her getting more calcium into her body without without taking a safe form of calcium.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
Absolutely. It's amazing how everything is related.
Real life. Yeah.
Right? I mean, and here's the diagram relating the calcium and the parathyroid gland and the thyroid gland. So again, the release of the release of calcitonin by the thyroid gland has nothing to do with PTH being released by the adrenal cord, the anterior pituitary. Okay, so again, the thyroid releasing calcitonin, that's just based on how much calcium is in your body. And if there's not enough calcium in your body, if there's enough, you're going to store that calcium. If there's not enough calcium, your parathyroid glands are going to release parathyroid hormone and go this way. Then we get to the adrenal glands. So I had asked before, where are the adrenal glands? I think it was River that correctly pointed out above the kidneys, right? They are also sometimes called the suprarenal glands, just above the kidneys, on top of the kidneys. They are shaped like a pyramid. They sit on top of the kidney. And they are divided into two portions, a cortex and a medulla. A lot of organs are divided into a cortex and a medulla. The cortex is the outer thickness. The medulla is the inner part. In the case of the adrenal glands, if you look at it under a microscope, you can definitely see a difference between the cortex and the medulla. In the case of the adrenal gland, the cortex secretes different hormones than the medulla. The cortex is stimulated by ACTH. So your anterior pituitary secretes ACTH, which stimulates your adrenal cortex. That's the C part of ACTH. Your adrenal medulla is stimulated by a direct link to your brain. So there's like hardwiring from your brain to your adrenal medulla that when you perceive a threat, you are stimulating your adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So what does the cortex release? Well, it produces more than 24 steroid hormones. Collectively, they are called corticosteroids. They are essential for metabolism and vital for life. They are transported in the plasma, bound to proteins, and there are like 3 zones of the cortex that produce 3 different types. So within that cortex, within that outer layer of the adrenal gland, there's actually 3, it can be divided into 3 smaller layers. The zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Okay, and they are producing different corticosteroids. The glomerulosa is producing mineralocorticoids, the fasciculata is producing glucocorticoids, and the reticularis produces androgens. What are androgens? You guys probably know what those are.
It's hormones that released during puberty.
Mm-hmm. Hormones that are released during puberty, usually associated with the male hormone testosterone. Everybody produces testosterone, male or female. And the reason is because it's necessary for things like muscle production. So while males produce more testosterone because their testes also produce testosterone, everybody produces some testosterone from their kidneys, or I'm sorry, from their adrenal glands above their kidneys. So some of these other ones, there are examples of things like glucocorticoids, like cortisol is a glucocorticoid. And where have you heard of cortisol or cortisone? When have you heard of that?
Injections or
Anti-inflammation.
or yeah,
Like when you have
creams.
anti-itch creams, yeah,
Itch cream,
inflammation.
exactly. So all of those are examples of glucocorticoids. The actual hormone cortisol, it inhibits inflammation. So oftentimes if an athlete hurts a joint, right, they hurt a knee or an elbow, they might get those injections, cortisol injections, because it's going to reduce the inflammation. Even with something like poison ivy, right, you get a cream, you get cortisone cream, and you put that on your skin because it's reducing the inflammation in your skin, right? So those are anti-inflammatories. Then the adrenal medulla, this is the part that's hardwired to your brain to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is adrenaline. right? And then we get to some other kind of lesser talked about glands. The pineal gland. The pineal gland is in your brain. It's located in the epithalamus above the thalamus. This is secreting melatonin. And that's not melanin, which we talked about earlier. Melatonin is, what does melatonin do? Or when have you heard of melatonin?
Promotes sleep.
Promotes sleep, right? Melatonin is actually a hormone that promotes our sleep cycles. So circadian rhythms, you may have heard of. So the fact that we want to, as humans, we want to be awake when it's light out and asleep when it's dark out, which is thought to lead to a lot of issues like seasonal affective disorder, where a lot of people are more depressed during the winter because there's a lot less hours of daylight. That's a real thing. And that this hormone is partially to blame for that. So then we get to some organs that have more than just endocrine function. Okay, but we have to talk about them because they have some endocrine function. And I think we'll talk about this one for today. The pancreas. So the pancreas is both endocrine and exocrine. Okay, it has an endocrine function where it produces something that stays within the body, and it has an exocrine function where it produces something that goes to the outside of the body. The pancreas lies between our stomach and our small intestine, so it's kind of just underneath our stomach, just inferior to our stomach. It has ducts that lead to the small intestine, and through those ducts, it secretes enzymes which help us break down our food. So it's secreting enzymes directly into the small intestine. That is exocrine. Okay, even though we think of the small intestine as being inside the body, it's really just a tube going through our body, right? It's like a donut, right? It's going from our mouth to our anus. It's just a tube that goes all the way through the body. So anything that's secreted into our digestive tract is considered outside the body, right? It's not actually inside our bloodstream. So that's the exocrine function of the pancreas. And you'll learn about that with the digestive system. As an endocrine organ, it also produces two hormones that get into our bloodstream. And those hormones regulate how much glucose is in our blood. And those hormones are glucagon and insulin. So if you look at the pancreas under a microscope, you can see the difference between the cells that secrete glucagon and insulin. Those cells are called pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. And those look different than the exocrine cells. And so here's an example of, this is what our pancreas looks like. So our stomach would be right here, just superior to it. Here is the first part of our small intestine, the duodenum. And you can see that there's a duct that leads from the pancreas into the duodenum, called the pancreatic duct. That's all the exocrine function of pancreas. When you look at this under a microscope, you can see that these cells, which are surrounded by this black dotted line, are much lighter in color. Those cells are called the islet of Langerhans. That's an area where the pancreas is producing insulin and glucagon. The cells around it, which are darker pink, are producing more of the exocrine functions. Okay. So why do we produce insulin and glucagon? It's to regulate blood glucose, right? What do we use glucose for? Why is it important?
For energy.
Good, for energy.
Yeah.
Absolutely, for energy. All of our cells need it for energy. So whether you're talking about muscles contracting, or you're talking about active transport, right, getting things into and out of the cell, or you're talking about building up larger molecules, linking, amino acids together for proteins that we need. All of that takes energy. We get that energy from glucose, and it gets into our bloodstream based on us eating. As I said, anything you eat or drink gets into your bloodstream. So here's the way it works, or it's supposed to work. You eat a meal, and you always are eating more glucose than you can possibly use at that moment. And so what happens is you're using whatever glucose you need, but your pancreas produces insulin, which goes and it takes that extra glucose that's in your blood and it stores it, okay? And it stores it in places like your liver, It stores it in your muscles. It can also convert it to fat and store it as fat. And then if you haven't eaten anything, say you've gone 6 or 8 hours and you haven't eaten a meal, the amount of glucose in your blood is very low. So what happens then is your pancreas produces the other hormone, glucagon, which says, well, I know where to get glucose. I'll go to the liver where you just stored it, and I'll pull that glucose out, and it'll come, it'll be back out into your bloodstream where you can use it. So that's how it's supposed to normally work. Now, if somebody's a diabetic, either they don't produce insulin, or they're producing a type of insulin that's not being recognized by the cells, or their cells don't have the right receptors. Remember, they have to have the correct receptors for the hormone. All of those different things are ways people can have diabetes. And the bottom line is that when somebody who's diabetic eats a meal, no matter what they eat, they have more sugar than they're using at that point. They have more glucose in their blood than they can use. But they don't have insulin. They don't have the ability to have insulin take that extra sugar and store it. So what happens is the body gets rid of it, right? You pass it through the kidneys and it passes out through your urine. And so now that person has the danger of crashing. Right now that person's got low blood glucose. And if they don't have anything to eat for several hours, then there's nowhere for them to get glucose from, right? They don't have it stored in their liver because their insulin wasn't working properly, so they couldn't store it in the liver. And so they can crash. And that's always the biggest concern with the diabetic. High blood sugar is problematic and causes problems and, causes problems with the eyes and the kidneys and things like that. But one of the more immediate problems is the other end of that, the crash. When you haven't had a meal for a long time and your blood glucose levels crash, right? You can pass out. You can actually go into a diabetic coma. That's why a lot of times diabetics need to have something on hand to get sugar into their system really quickly. Orange juice is always one of the things people say, right? That'll get into somebody's bloodstream really quickly if you can get a few sips of orange juice into their body. But that's why that's happening. That's the relationship between insulin and glucagon and diabetes.
Insulin is what makes the glucose be able to go into the cells, right? Is that?
It's what takes the extra glucose from your bloodstream and stores it in places that you can access it later.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Right. So if you have diabetes, you don't have any glucose stored up to access when your blood sugar dips.
Right. I thought there was something about it having something to do with the ability to cross the cell wall or something too. No?
Nah, I don't think necessarily.
I probably just read it wrong or something, but I thought it was in the chapter. I'll have to find it again. I don't know. Anyway, okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So here you can see, it's a very similar thing to what we saw with calcium before. This is glucose, so this is being regulated by insulin and glucagon rather than calcitonin and PTH. So what I'm going to do is stop there. We can go into this a little bit more tomorrow. There's a little bit more of this chapter to do, and I figured we can do some review of like the nervous system, some of that stuff, because that will be coming up on the test, which I'll be posting on Friday for you guys. So what kind of questions do you guys have? So I was thinking tomorrow I can gain access to certain like games that we can play. Like I know there's like Jeopardy style quiz games through Pearson that I can get to, and there's quiz. Do you ever play Kahoot? It's like an online game where you can, it's just a review thing. Like, okay, there's a question that says, what is it? So everybody gets their smartphone out, and they start a Kahoot, and there's a code that everybody puts into their smartphone, and then it automatically says, okay, 18 people are registered, and then it gives the question and it waits 20 seconds and then it says how many people, gave A, B, C, or D as answers. And so I can kind of judge whether people are on the right track or, where we need to discuss things more or whatever. Plus it's just a good review and it's kind of fun to do.
I like that idea.
All right.
Yep.
All right. Well, then I'll go ahead and I'll look up some Kahoots that are relevant to what we do, what we studied, and all that stuff.
Can I ask a question about the pancreas?
Yeah.
And diabetes? Like my daughter, I think I told you she's type 1 diabetic. Do
Mhm.
you know why the pancreas just all of a sudden stops producing? I've asked her endocrinologist, nobody knows. It just happens.
Yeah, with type 1 diabetes, I don't think anybody knows. I think it's probably just a genetic mutation that happens. Like she was probably born with it, right? Because she was diagnosed young.
It was just it's actually been a year as of 2 days ago.
Okay.
She was 8 when she was diagnosed. I mean, I
Right.
saw
But I mean,
signs.
how would you diagnose it before that, though? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, and I guess it does take a while. I mean, right before she was diagnosed, and looking back now, I see all the signs that she had
Mhm.
and then COVID hit, so I couldn't get her into
Right.
nobody would see her. I was like, oh, she's just a kid. But
She's
she lost
tired or whatever.
weight. She was drinking water straight through the night, up all night
Yep.
long, drinking water, peeing all night long, eating us at a house and home, but yet she lost like 15 pounds.
Wow.
It's crazy. She lost a lot of weight, yeah.
Wow.
And then she took sick but it's just strange how some people
Now,
are just in their 40s.
Is it that she doesn't produce insulin, or is it that she doesn't have the receptors for the insulin she's producing?
No, she's type 1,
doesn't
so
have
there's
insulin.
no.
So
Yep.
she takes insulin now, synthetic insulin.
She's on a pump, which is amazing. The godsend. I can sleep sort of at night.
Right,
But,
knowing
yeah.
that it's regulating it throughout the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear the alarms. She doesn't hear the alarms, but she's handled it very well. I'm so proud of her.
Oh, good. That's
I
awesome.
took it harder than her. I still have my days. I'm like, this is my baby. This is the rest of her life. But
Right. I mean, I think about that. I have,
different.
I have 3 kids. 2 of them are still really little. One's 4, one's 1.5, and it's scary because there's so many things that you can't diagnose that
You don't know. I mean,
it
it's
could just be
fair.
a cold or whatever, or it could be something serious that you don't know. And it's just so hard to tell with little ones.
Yeah, I thought she had the flu. She had all the symptoms of the flu except for the high fever. Her temperature was normal, but yet she had all the other signs until I had to rush her to the hospital because she almost passed out. So glad I did when I did, but
Exactly.
she's good now. Yeah,
Well,
it's
that's
just
good to
weird
hear.
how it just stops. I don't know. It's just strange.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I mean,
Yeah.
type 2 people know that, okay, you've had so much glucose that your body stops responding to the insulin that you're producing, usually with type 2. But nobody really knows for type 1. I don't think why it happens. It must just be a genetic mutation.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had just said about the receptors, or you had asked if she didn't have the receptors or didn't produce insulin. Does that differentiate the type, or is that just 2 possibilities?
I think those are just 2 possibilities. The type is just differentiated by whether it's
You need insulin or not.
something you're born with or something that develops.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that there was a lack in some cases of the receptors. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh. All right.
I wonder if somehow they'll develop another RNA style, not vaccine, but something to like recode the development of like receptors or something with that case at some point.
Sure. There's a lot of so when I was in grad school almost 20 years ago now, there was a lot of work being done on genetic engineering. I don't want to say genetic engineering, but on gene transfer, on replacing, say somebody has a mutation in a gene, replacing that with the normal version of that gene, and what that would mean. And it would be this big, huge breakthrough in medical science. And what ended up happening is that in most cases when they did this in people, or when they did it in trials, there were unforeseen consequences, right? In other words, you just think you're replacing this one gene, but then like it causes all these other domino effects that nobody saw coming. And so it turns out that there's a lot more relation to, to everything that's going on. Than we understand. When I was in grad school, it was the human genome project was a huge thing, and hey, if we can get the human genome sequenced, then we can solve all these different diseases and treat all these different diseases. Well, it turns out that only 1% of our DNA encodes for all the proteins that we know of. So what is the other 99% doing? Right? In the papers that were written at that time called that 99% junk DNA. Well, there's no way it's junk. There's no way our body would produce, our body would spend the energy to produce that much DNA that wasn't doing something. It's doing something. We just don't understand what. So it's a weird thing when you think you're replacing just this one little gene therapy. When you think you're replacing this one little gene, it actually ends up causing all these other effects that you didn't know were going to happen.
Yeah, like at first glance, it seems simple and it's anything but. It's like way more complex than we'll probably ever understand.
Right. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to understand it.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
In some ways,
Yeah. On a completely unrelated thing, when I logged on to GCC today, when I logged on to get onto Moodle, there's a poet that is doing a thing. I forget what her name is already now. She's doing, I think it's a virtual thing where you can hear her talk and maybe do some of her poetry and stuff. And I was like, oh my God, I recognize her, and I recognize the name, and I recognized her from Virginia Tech. In 2007, I worked at Virginia Tech and I taught there, and unfortunately I lost one of my students that day. And she was the person that wrote like the address, basically. Like they had a big convocation. The president was there. It was President Bush at the time, about the shootings that happened, and she gave a really great poem that kind of uplifted everybody. And so I remember her from that, and she's a really a good poet. She was a literature professor at Virginia Tech at the time. I don't know if she's still there, but Nikki Giovanni, that's her name, Nikki Giovanni. So if any of you get a chance to check her out, she's pretty cool.
Thank you. I noticed that today too. I was curious.
Yeah.
Good job. That's great.
Yeah, she reminds me a little bit of the I forget the name of the young woman that did the poetry at the inauguration. It did a really great job. I forget her name already, which is horrible. But she reminds me of that type of poet. Anyway, so for what it's worth, she's cool. Check her out. So I will see you guys tomorrow. We'll finish going over the endocrine system. I'll come up with some kind of review opportunities for the nervous system, since we're all, we all had a week off, and that was been 2 or 3 weeks since we've studied a lot of the nervous system stuff. So we'll go through some of that stuff too. All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Good.
you. It was a great class.
Thank you.
You're welcome.